Evolution.org Hardcore 2.0 is coming your way, episode 129. Today we're going to talk about which steroids should a newbie use, presented by Beligas. So this one we're going to actually start off with Mobster telling a heartwarming story. I'm going to spend a few minutes on that just to let what goes on out there in real life. We're going to talk about what the definition of what a newbie is. We're going to talk about does it really matter what a newbie uses. We're talking about recommended Belagas newbie cycles and why. And we're going to
Yeah.
finish off talking about the Belagas high quality products and their customer service. So let's first talk about Mobster has a heartwarming story about saving someone's life who's ready to commit suicide, I think. Why don't you tell that story?
So, as Steve knows, and as some of you listeners know, and of course, by definition, doing these shows, I'm the kind of person that I could probably, if I got paid to talk, Steve, by the word, I'd be a millionaire. It's almost kind of funny. When I'm out and about, when I'm in social situations, when I'm at the gym, I'm happy to chat away. Probably because I spend most of the time in the house between these shows and on the forums or whatever else on my own. So, not talking. So, I make up for it. People that follow me on Facebook will see that I'm out. We've got something locally called the Comeback Wetlands, taking pictures. I'm part of the group. I'm like the person that runs their competition for photographs. It's one of my other interests. And because people are down there for the same thing, to enjoy nature, to look at the wildlife, the ducks, the trees, local birds, and even occasionally talking to me about my pictures, we'll stop and have a natter. And it's always that kind of semi-social situation, Steve, where we've all got something in common for the minute. Very rarely will we be talking about politics or anything else. It's pretty much, the weather and obviously the wildlife and peace and quiet and feeding the ducks and whatever else. So I was talking to one fella as I was walking back just now, ready to do the show with Steve, and another bloke who's got some sort of speech impediment. I think might be partially deaf, Steve, came up to me and kind of gestured, and I remembered him from before, and says, "So, oh, about whether you remember." I says, "Yeah, of course, man, on the footpath ages ago now, and you have to make sure that you're looking at him so he can read your lips and so on and so forth." And he asked me what my name was, and I told him. And me and the other fellow were chatting back and forth between the three of us. And at some point, just towards the end of the conversation, and literally, as I kind of half jokingly said to Steve, almost had to be rude to leave him, bless, because of doing his shows with Steve and time and everything else. He said, "You saved my life," which is a bit kind of like, random, really, Steve. You don't expect someone to say that just as you're walking home with your shopping after the gym, etc. And I said, "What do you mean? What have I done? What have I said that's made this happen?" He said, "You stopped to talk to me and had a conversation with me up by the railway line." And he said, "I think if someone hadn't, you hadn't, I might have thrown myself on the railway. And it was just your stopping to see how I was, having a 5 minute chat, let me get things off my chest, that made me not feel suicidal, made me not think about throwing myself under one of the trains." And I was like, honestly, it was kind of weird because first, you don't know what to say. You appreciate that perhaps you've done something. And it's one of those little standout moments for the day, or week, the month, the year, or whatever else. But ironically, as I said, I said, I've really got to go because I should be doing this podcast with Stevesmi at 12 o'clock when we record the shows, my noon here, my time. Um, but you're more than welcome. You are, me stopping to talk to you is nothing for me. Me giving you 10, 15, 20 minutes of my time when I'm out and about in the weather is, and this is more of a message to you guys than it is to the person themselves because they know how they felt. They've told me how they felt. They told me what difference it made, but it's for you guys. This is, and as a local person, I relatively lives 10, 15 minutes away from me, Steve, just being part of the community and whatever else. But giving someone 5 minutes to get something off their chest, to lift up their day, be positive. You're outside, you're in nature, you're in the fresh air, you're in the sunshine, even on a cold winter's day, that brisk, cold wind, whatever else can liven you up. There's positive ions, difference between being stuck indoors and depressed and being outside talking to people, and making 5 minutes or whatever time it was just to talk shit, just to talk randomly, just for you, in his case, to get something off his chest. And then, in his case, again, this morning, Steve, making the time to go and say to that person, me, that I'd made that difference. So that makes me feel good at the same way as obviously I made him feel good then. So it's one of those kind of strange situations that we get the occasional, and I've had moments of my time back in 2011, Steve, I think when my mental health was struggling, and just going out for a walk made a difference. Just being out in the sunshine made a difference. And in this case, having someone to talk to would have made an even bigger difference. Just, as we say, getting the crap off your chest. We see this a little bit on the forums from time to time, Steve, where people are struggling because their testosterone levels are low, and life and work and school, and even just because they're in the gym and perhaps they're not making progress and whatever. Okay, might be that you're struggling to adapt to a new program. You're not used to high levels or low levels of testosterone or whatever else. And having 5 minutes, and even Steve and I have done this. We've had 5 minute chin wags before and after the show, little chats where we talk about stuff that's going on in their life just for 5 minutes. Like we talk about our cats, neighbours, the value of the Bitcoin, whatever. And it's just a
Yep.
way. It's just a way for me and you to relax for 5 minutes and almost get into the kind of chilled vibe that we like to have on these shows.
So even
So
though
anyway,
this,
that's
yeah,
that's the story
even
for the day.
so, even though this podcast is evergreen, we are actually recording it during the holiday season. And the holiday
Hmm.
season is the number one time of year where people commit suicide. And it's the
Yes,
number one time of year where people get depressed. I read a statistic that 55% of people hate the holidays. They get stressed out. The family
they
situation.
overthink it, Steve. They try to be perfect when you can
It's
just be
turned, yeah,
yourself.
because
Yeah,
yeah, and then the way it is the way
commercialized. Yeah,
yeah, it's commercialized and stuff where it takes away from what the holidays is really about, and it's packed on the roadways. It takes you forever. It takes you an extra hour to drive to and from work. It's just a mess out there. You can't even go anywhere. I
let,
order
let,
everything online, so it's
let me
really
give you
this time of
one
year.
one example, Steve. That as
Yeah.
an older person and a little bit older than Steve, I saw this the other day, and I think it applies no matter where you live in the world. Okay, so it was the meme was something like people judging the value of how much money has been spent on a present. And it said if it's, for example, 20 UK pounds or even $25 US, think about the amount of time that person had to work to earn that money to buy you that present. Now, kids, especially with commercialization and expectations, could be, I want an Xbox, I want a PlayStation, I want this, I want that. And these things could be hundreds of dollars. I'm of that generation, and my dad taught me this story a long time ago. We would ask my dad many times what you wanted for Christmas, and it was always like socks and pants or a tie or something really crappy that by the end we could easily afford. It was a few bucks, Steve. But he told us a story, and the meme the other day told us a story. And I'm an age now, but I appreciate it more than I did then. It's
Yeah.
not the money, it's the thought. If someone cares enough to buy you a present, even if it's just a $10 gift card or $20 gift card or whatever, they thought of you enough to put the effort in, and they've done the work, they've saved up the money for that to happen. So I appreciate the small things now rather than big expensive things, which I can buy for myself anyway.
Absolutely. And one thing to do is do something for someone, like what Mobster did, do something for someone, be
Yeah,
friendly.
yeah, that was nothing for
And
me. It was
and
easy.
people, yeah, people need to stop being trolling others and being assholes to others. Seems like that's a trend we have now in society where people tend to do that. And make people feel bad and put people down, and that's not what it's all. It's really a sad situation. A lot of people go through a tough time during the holidays because it's bad memories. They lost a
Mm,
loved one during the holidays, they lost a
yeah,
spouse, they lost a son or daughter or a parent or something. So the holidays can be a miserable time for them. So just be more understanding of others and other human beings. So let's move on then. Let's talk about
yeah.
definition of
Newbies. Yep.
let's talk about newbies and let's define newbies. So, I was thinking about this, when we were prepping for this show. So for me, there's a different ways to kind of angle this. You can look at it a different perspective. You can consider a newbie someone who's new to steroids. You've never used steroids before, that makes you a newbie. But there's different levels. Just because you've never used steroids before, maybe you've been researching them on the forum and listening to this podcast for months and months and months where you've really gained a lot of knowledge on them, or You could be a newbie who's completely new. You're listening to this show for the first time and you're completely new to steroids, but maybe a friend of yours is using them, so now you want to get into them. Maybe the only knowledge you have of steroids is from that friend who tells you. That's how I started as a newbie. I had a friend who told me, yeah, I used steroids years ago. You should use this steroid, you should that steroid. So I started to research it, and that's
Mm,
how I actually came across these forums, not Evo, because Evo didn't exist at the time, but I came across other forums, other bodybuilding forums, and I started to research about steroids. And so definition of newbie can mean different things, in terms of maybe you've been researching it for 2 or 3 years, maybe you've been researching it for 2 months, maybe you just started researching it yesterday. So there can be a little very different situations, but I think in general, I would consider someone a newbie when it comes to steroids is someone who's just either never used them before or who's maybe done 1 or 2 cycles so far. I think that could be constituted as a newbie too. How about you, Mobster? What do you think?
I think the best definition is that combination of not quite up to par on the knowledge, specifically the experience of how it's going to work for them, and probably combine that with someone who's never actually taken steroids before. You and I know, just very quickly, of people whose literal response to steroids or testosterone specifically can be so good. I'm thinking of those people that have a low affinity or low production of testosterone that when they go on TRT, it transforms their life. But that's not the case for every single person. And what we sometimes see also is people, as Steve said, even if they've done a couple of cycles, they won't know how every steroid is going to work in their system. They won't have done multiple cycles. They won't have learned coping mechanisms. So a lot of what we try to put across would be things like you might feel like this if you use tren. You might have bloat if you use this drug, and so on and so forth. So for me, it's the probably best way to put it in terms of PEDs may well be the lack of experience. It's literally their first cycle. And as I say, adding a little bit of they're not quite sure about the dosages and so on and so forth. Ironically, and of course, we include this show, guys, listeners, you have access to more information than you've ever had before. And yes, occasionally appreciate that sometimes that's almost too much to take in. It's easier to listen to Steve and I having a back and forth than it is to read perhaps a dry article or a anabolic steroid reference type book or whatever, because of the way that comes across. And it doesn't really help you with your aims, your needs. So, for example, we might touch upon when we talk about does it matter what a newbie uses and get some steroid cycles or steroid suggestions. Not every person using steroids has the same aim. Mine is to be stronger. Other people will be more muscular, leaner, to cut down, to lose weight, to be more athletic. And so, even if we made a very simple reference, um, it wouldn't necessarily apply to everybody. I'll give you an example myself, and I think Stevesmi will do the same. So, my very, very first, and I think I've mentioned this on a couple of other shows, Steve, was very simple Dynabol. It was probably the number one steroid, and probably ironically still kind of is, especially as orals are concerned. Simplest, cheapest, most effective, guaranteed kind of results, especially for a newbie. And the newbie's response to steroids, I think we should talk about as well, Steve, is crazy. And I did a very, very simple, the first 2 or 3 cycles, in fact, were 30 milligrams a day, so 210 milligrams a week for 8 weeks. And I probably ran that cycle 3 times, 1 year after another year after another year. I was only doing 1 cycle a year. The very first cycle was not around competitions, and it was just let's see what the effects. Let's see if I can manage the effects, and how I respond and the results I get, and if it makes that much of a difference to me in terms of my training. So, what about you, Steve? And I'll talk about my results, but what about your first cycle as well?
Yeah, and for me, I was weight training. This was around the time I was getting injuries, was I was doing the triathlons. This was in my mid to late 20s, and I just got tired of being injured.
Yeah.
I was dealing with so many different injuries from the triathlons, and that's the type of person I am. I was trying to push through these injuries. It was very, very frustrating. So I said, you know what? Let me go back to my roots. Let me go back to weight training. This was my roots. This was my roots as a teenager, powerlifting and weight training and building mass. So I decided to go back to it. And a friend of mine, he said, you know what? He's like, 5 or 6 years ago, I was in my early 20s and I used this steroid and I used that steroid. I used DECA and I used uh, testosterone cypionate. So I said, you know what? Let me look into this. So I started researching and I was like, man, I saw seeing some transformations online. I was like, man, I need to try this because I'm in the gym busting my ass and it didn't seem like I was improving like I wanted to improve. I improved a lot quicker when I was doing triathlons, but when it came to weight training, it's like I couldn't get my strength up. I couldn't get 3 plates. As much as I tried, I couldn't get 3 plates. And I kept trying to push myself and push myself. I was very strong for an Addy, but I wasn't able to get super strong like some of the other dudes in the gym. So I was like, fuck it, let me just try it. And I went to order testosterone cypionate, and the source that I was using didn't even have it. So that's one of the benefits of Belagas. Belagas has everything in
Oh yeah,
stock. This
everything.
source didn't have it. That didn't have a lot of stuff in stock. So what I had to end up doing is I ended up having to use their Sustanon instead. That was the only thing they had in stock. So I got the Sustanon and the Deca, and I got Debo as well.
Mm.
And like you, Mobster, Debo was my first steroid that I ever used. I used the
Yeah,
because it was in the oral, and I noticed right away, man, within the first few days, man, my strength, I could feel the strength. Instead of being able to do 6 reps on the same weight, I was able to do 8 reps. And
yeah,
from then, I was just able to get strong as fuck. So that was my first foray. And again, I researched. I went
yes.
online, I researched on forums about these compounds. I read every article I could about these compounds to give myself knowledge. But at the end of the day, you can read all day and night about something.
Yeah,
You have to do it to really understand the way the steroids actually work because and you have to do both. You have to read, gain knowledge, and then you have to do it in the end. So I know a lot of people out there, they're like, oh, you shouldn't use steroids until you really research them, you really learn about them, blah blah blah. That is true, but at the same time I can see the other perspective of, you know what, at the end of the day, if you really, really want to learn, and a lot of you learn differently. I was a teacher. I mentioned this sometimes. I was a teacher. I know that different people learn different ways. And some of you are going to learn infinitely more about using steroids as a newbie by actually doing it.
yeah,
So, and you're going to have to eventually do it because you're going to have to learn things about using steroids, like injecting, for example. Injecting was the hardest fucking thing I had to do as a newbie. I can
yeah,
remember my
yeah,
first
yeah.
injection. I had a mirror in a closet, and I was like, I made the decision, I'm going to pin into my shoulder as my first injection. I was so nervous. I ended up, the first time I loaded the syringe, I actually cut my face with the needle. Somehow it
Jesus,
got on my
what
face
the
and cut
fuck
my.
were you doing?
I was so nervous. Then once I finally got the courage to inject, I injected it and it went in. And I was kind of surprised. I didn't even feel anything when it went in. And then
Mm,
I injected it
mm,
and the pain was so bad the next day. I ended
yeah,
up injecting 500 milligrams of Sustanon into my shoulder. I only meant to inject 250 milligrams, but
but why did you have 500 in the syringe?
I was
What the
so
fuck?
confused and nervous, and I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
going
yeah,
back and forth, like, did I
yeah.
put the right amount? That I ended up putting the
Too
wrong
much.
amount, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So I was like, and I learned my lesson the hard way because my shoulder hurt like hell for like a week from the post-injection pain. So that pharmacy grade Sustanon, the old school
Yes.
pharmacy grade Sustanon hurt like hell. Okay, it's not like it is today. Like Belagas now, they have a Sustanon
Oh, smooth now.
that's
Yeah,
much smoother. But at
yeah.
the time, can you imagine? And so I learned my lesson the hard way. So I was so fucking nervous. But you've got, like, again, you can read all you want on the internet and
Mm,
watch all the videos you want about injecting. But
yeah,
until you actually do it, you're not going to learn. Like I learned number one, make sure you're putting in the right amount. And I learned number
Yes.
two, I use ice. I use an ice pack to numb not
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
muscle,
Yeah.
but I use it to numb the skin. And that really helped because it was kind of like, using like lidocaine, to kind of numb the area so you don't feel the needle. So that
Yeah.
kind of helped on my first cycle just to numb the top of the skin. That's where the nerves are. Most of the nerves are on the top of the skin. So really, that's why I didn't feel anything because I numbed it really
Yeah.
good. And when I injected, it just went right through. But I was moving the needle so much too that caused a lot of post injection
Yeah,
pain.
that's what I still do, Stephen. If occasionally I've talked about this on another show, it isn't necessarily me injecting. I pull the skin tight, the needle goes in lovely. It's me being inflexible and slightly cack-handed, trying to get myself into the right position to push the plunger that moves the needle around. So on a very rare occasion, I think the last injectable cycle, uh, late last year, early this year, uh, I was having a bit of post-injection pain on the first couple of injections in months because I was moving the damn needle around inside the muscle. That was just down to me being rigid. I had actually the same terms of the research, Steve. I was incredibly lucky. Number one, I left it a very long time. I was 37 years of age. So that meant I trained for 22 years. Number two, I had brought two books, one by the late Paul Borison and one by another steroid guru at that time, who's still alive, still with us, called Mick Hart here in the UK. And I even ended up some years after that, I was on Mix Forum. I believe I was a moderator on Mix Forum at some point. I certainly was on the forum for years. And I've even been drinking with Mick. And both Mick and the late Paul Borison were very helpful to me with my little magazine. And so I'd had personal conversations in person, over the telephone, met people who knew people, that kind of stuff. And in fact, for example, we talked about the pharmaceutical stuff that came in from Pakistan and Europe versus what we can get here in the UK, and how easy it is to get Beligas, for example, posted to you. That was not the situation back in the day. And Paul Borison even sent me supplements for some particular training cycle that I was doing. So I think just very quickly that Steve mentioned as well, that first pin, always was easy. Even coping with the results, etc., was relatively easy. And I said I'd mentioned the results earlier. Gained 10 pounds, kicked 6 pounds, probably the first two times, and slightly less on the third time. So I definitely responded well to the Dynabol. On the first injection, you just reminded me. So my last story, which is my buddy, my old business partner, are still in contact, and I decided to both do our first injectables at the same time. And he comes to my little two-bed terrace in Gloucester, and we sat there. I don't think it was quite like a porn movie, Steve, making eye contact and not looking what we were doing, but that was probably the easiest pin I've ever had. Purely and simply because we were kind of nervous. We were looking at each other, not looking at what we're doing, and it just went in, and it was no big deal. Been more of a pain, so to speak. I prefer to inject in my quads. It was more. It can just be a bit of a faff when I've got bigger, so it's become harder to be in the same place and so on and so forth. It's still relatively easy compared to before, and the nerves have been and gone. I'm just annoyed if it's slightly uncomfortable now more than anything else. Um, but yeah, it's kind of weird. We know the mistakes people have made. We know people aren't always aware of they should pin, and we've done shows on how to do that, including, as Steve said, with the ice and so on and so forth. It can even be people's issue with injecting using a syringe, etc., by association. So we get that some of you will be nervous. We get that some of you want to sort of break the back, the learn break, lose your virginity, lose your syringe pinning virginity, etc., etc. And we understand pretty much everybody knows how that first syringe, etc., situation goes. And even like I said again, you have an idea if you've done research on what it might be like, what your results might be like, what can I expect if I do this cycle, these kind of questions. But it's still, I would actually touch on this before we move on, Steve. I would say, and I agree with other gurus that talked about this, that first time you do a debol, that first time you do an injectable cycle, you'll probably have the best results you've ever had, certainly compared to where you've been before. Gaining 10 pounds on and keeping six when the average had been £3 a year is And you've just done for 8 weeks, Steve. You could do another 8 week cycle later in the year and gain another 6 pounds. So the idea that you're going to go 3 pounds of muscle year on year, if you really keep grinding away as a natty, versus arguably 3, 4, 5, 6 pounds every time for the first few cycles, blows your fucking mind. And it's why too many young people kind of jump on. You've got to remember, as I said, I was 37. I was very nearly middle aged and 22 years training. So, yeah, let's talk about Steve, too much on us and a little bit more. Does it matter what we think a newbie uses? I'm going to say yes, but I'll let Steve start this one.
Look, it's important to learn trial and error and correct your mistakes. And the same thing goes with steroids. Too many people out there, and they do this with nutrition as well. They'll eat something that fucks up their stomach, and then they'll keep eating it. I see this with protein powder, for example. Well, this pro bodybuilder, this guy on Instagram, he's very muscular, very strong, so he drinks protein powder. So I'm going to keep drinking it, even though it tears up my stomach. I have diarrhea, I have nausea, and it makes me sick. I'm just going to keep drinking it anyway. We see this a lot. So it's very, very important to listen to your body. There's no weakness in listening to your body, guys. I mean, I don't understand. That's being smart. So trial and error is important. Just like on the last segment, I talked about my injection. I fucked up my first injection. It did not go well. I learned from that, and I did not repeat the same mistake again. I
Yes.
learned why did I put twice the amount I was supposed to put in the syringe. I went back and I looked at the math. I thought about it. I wrote down some math and I said, you know what happened here? And I realized the mistake I made. I actually was correct in my dosing, but then had second thoughts and I thought about it again. And I was like, you know what? I actually should do 2 cc's instead of 1 cc's to get 500 milligrams a week, but it was wrong. I was supposed to do 1 cc twice a week, and
Yes.
but for some reason I ended up doing the full 2 cc's in one injection. So it was supposed to be a split. So I was kind of going back and I figured out the mistake I made, and I didn't make that mistake again. Same thing with the injections. When I injected, I was moving the needle around too much. So I said, you know what? When I inject, I gotta calm down. I gotta learn what I did, and I can't do
Yeah,
that. Scratching my face with the needle, I learned not to be so nervous when I'm loading the
yeah.
syringe, not to move the needle
Put it
around.
down.
Always keep the cap on the needle unless you're
Yes.
ready to inject. Don't
Yes.
and try not to
Don't poke your eye out with it, crying out loud.
don't put the cap on the needle and touch the tip of the needle because I
Yeah.
did that as well. You got to make sure when you put it
Be
in,
sterile. Yeah.
you gotta. Well, it's not about sterile. It's about dulling the tip of the needle. You can't dull that top of the needle. It's got to
No.
be as sharp as possible. So when you're putting the
Yes.
cap on, you can't have the cap touch the tip of the needle. That's another thing.
They're
If it's
very
not
fragile. They bend very easily, blunt
yeah,
very
and if
easily.
it bends and you inject it, it's
Yeah,
gonna
it's going to hurt like a bitch.
it's gonna cause a lot of issues. It's gonna cause a bigger hole than you have to. So you gotta learn.
What
So
about what about Steve? What about Steve? The idea we see this sometimes, especially more recent years. You aren't a professional. You are not a competing bodybuilder. You are a guy that's gone to the gym that wants to add muscle. This is most of our listeners want to be more muscular. So what we'll see, and Steve referred to the pro bodybuilder protein thing. I'll use that analogy as well, Steve. And I'm thinking of one particular four-time Mr. Olympia, so that's easy enough to figure out who I mean, was consuming somewhere at one point, Steve, between 500 and I believe at the most, when he was close to 300 pounds, 600 or 700 grams of protein per day. You are not a 300-pound Mr. Olympia. You do not need, for the most part, 500, 600, or 700 grams of protein. In the same context, in the same way, when it comes to does it matter what a newbie uses, you do not need. There's an argument to be made for and against, but I'll give you the against. You do not need to take what a top professional bodybuilder uses in order to respond really, really well. We've talked about pro cycles. We had our former, unfortunately passed away, Monstro, Marco Louis, talk about 5 grams, 5,000 milligrams a week, plus growth, plus insulin, plus peptides, and so on and so forth. And there's an argument that says, go hard, go heavy, blow the fuck up. but you've got no idea of how the stress is going to think on your body. You've got no idea just how, if your body's responded incredibly well. Putting on 20 pounds or even 25 pound of muscle is actually really uncomfortable. And again, you can't take it out. You might, for example, Steve, I would never, ever, and I think even a random trend lovers wouldn't say trend should be your first steroid. You might as well fucking go hard. You should go in with a gram or 2 grams, because why the fuck not? Because why? Why? You can't take it out. It's a little bit like putting a Ferrari engine into a Mini. Why? You can tune that Mini. You can put maybe a shoehorn a bigger engine in. You can go for whatever it is, 1,000 cc to 13, 1,400, 1,500 cc, and it'll transform that car. But if you were somehow able to shoehorn a V8, 4.5 litre, 4,500 cc engine under that bonnet, developing 800 horsepower, you'd probably blow the fucking car up, and it'd be screaming into some wall before you'd learn to control it and so on. And when it comes to steroids, there's an argument like, for example, managing the side effects of trend, even with people that have got experience, can be an issue. So you go, if are there steroids we wouldn't recommend to a newbie? Yes, there are steroids we would recommend, which we'll talk about, and those we say no, wait and see how you respond. Can you manage blood pressure issues? Can you manage water retention? How do I manage those things? And we talked about this on shows and on the forums, of course. If, like I said, you took something you responded incredibly well to, it's a dream for an underweight newbie, Steve, to add 20 pounds of muscle. But I've actually turned around and said, as I said a few seconds ago, 20 pounds of muscle that quick is fantastic, but also incredibly uncomfortable. I've talked about this on other shows, 2 or 3 cycles where my regular body weight would be 280 and I go to 300. This was great for strength, great for training, great for the competitions I was competing in, but kind of uncomfortable for me to get used to. 5 pounds of muscle, which is perfectly fine, used to take, and when I wanted to keep the muscle, Steve, would take me 12 to 16 weeks to get used to. And I just mean in terms of aches and pains and how it sits on my body, my cardiovascular ability because I've added body weight, and so on and so forth. Post-cycle, clearance from my system, etc., and just feeling normal, but 5 pounds heavier than where I was before. So yes, I think it does matter, Steve. I mean, let's talk about kind of what what would you not recommend? Why do you think people shouldn't do the crazy stuff? If 2 grams, 3 grams, not trend, etc., for a newbie.
It's important to learn as a newbie. Your first cycle is crucial in a lot of ways. So you have to know what works and what isn't the first time. Now, some of you are going to be more estrogen sensitive. Some of you aren't. Some of you are going to be more androgenic sensitive, where you're more sensitive to androgen. Some of you are going to be more sensitive to DHT derivative steroids. So there's going to be different steroids that you're going to have to learn. So I don't necessarily buy into the whole, well, your first cycle always has to be 500 milligrams of testosterone a week. It doesn't. Because some of you, it's not going to be advantageous to have that much aromatization on a first cycle. So at the end of the day, there isn't necessarily a first cycle that a newbie should be doing, but it should be dependent on yourself. But of course, you're not going to know that until you actually do it. So this is why it's not a good idea to use steroids as a first cycle that have multiple side effect potential. An example, anadrol. Anadrol has many different side effects that you need to watch out for. Now, it's a DHT derivative, so you got the DHT side effects. It binds to estrogen receptors, although it does not aromatize, but it still binds to estrogen receptors. So you have the potential to end up with gyno using anadrol or other estrogen-related side effects like blow and insomnia and all that stuff. It's very androgenic, so now you have the androgenic side effects to worry about, and it's very liver toxic, so now you have the liver toxicity to worry about. You see, so it's got all of that, And so, is that a good idea for a first cycle? No, because you may on the first cycle you're going to be dealing with so many different side effects at different angles that it's going to confuse you, and it's not going to be a correct cycle. Trenbolone, same thing. Trenbolone is so fucking anabolic and so fucking androgenic. It's so fucking inflammatory in the body. And I could go on and on. The way it fucks up your neurotransmitters in your brain, very bad idea for a first cycle. Very, very bad idea. So you want to use plain Jane steroids for your first cycle that you can kind of understand where they're coming from. Even something like Dianabol for a first cycle wouldn't be a bad idea because Dianabol, it's a plain Jane steroid. And really, the only thing with Dianabol that you're gonna know is coming is the aromatization because it rapidly aromatizes in the body, but you know it's coming. So if you end up really not liking Dynamo as a first cycle, you're like, man, it bloats me up too much. I'm getting itchy nipples on it. I'm getting all that stuff. That means you're estrogen sensitive. And now we know that for the future, and you can cross Dynamo off the list going forward. And you can cross a moderate to high amount of testosterone off the list. You want to avoid things that aromatize. So you've got to figure that out by doing them. But you can't figure it out by taking something like Anadrol or Tren or Superdrol or something that's really rough and has a lot of side effects because the side effects are gonna it's like going to battle and you've got arrows
No
coming at
shield,
you.
no spear.
You've got different things coming at you from every which direction, and you're
Yeah.
completely circled and you don't have any escape. So it's very, very important. At the end of the day, when you're using anabolic steroids, you can always just stop using them if the side effects get too
Yes, I
bad.
was going to say, Steve, on the orals, for example, not all orals, as Steve just said, but on the orals, and Dianabol is a great example again, and this is another reason perhaps why people use it for the first cycle. It's a relatively short half-life. If we, for example, said, oh, you should use a longer ester, and in the case of cypionate and undeclinate, etc., you might be looking at 16, 19, 20, 21 plus days. And that's just a half-life. It's still not cleared from the system. Whereas an oral steroid, most oral steroids are relatively short, Steve, like 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours. So in other words, it's out of your system or half life in less than a day and completely cleared from your system probably in about 5, 6, 7 days. I mean, completely gone, or almost to the point where you would notice it would barely show up on a test. And certainly in terms of your managing the side effects, you can also very quickly manipulate the numbers. As for example, Anavar, I've heard of competitive bodybuilders using 100 milligrams a day. Most people that use Anavar find the sweet spot is around 50 milligrams a day. And again, 4 to 8 weeks. But you could use less. Women should certainly use less. And Anavar's half-life is probably, what is that, Steve? 9 hours, 8 hours? People argue about half-lives, but it's a fraction of a day. The only issue perhaps with Anavar might be the pumps, and we've talked about the pumps on other shows. But again, you could lower the amount you're using very quickly, so you can literally change it the next day. I used to be very rigid with dosages on cycles, but Steve and I talked about it. Actually, it makes more sense to be flexible. You can't take out any of these once if you've consumed the oral, Steve, or you've injected it. It's there. So it's a lot easier to start low and build your way up. And even other things like, which is occasionally, I mean, very small percentage now, Steve, but people don't understand using AIs and to prevent issues. And even things like, for example, as you say, blood pressure, water retention, the shin pumps I've just mentioned on Anavar. There are ways of managing all these things. One reason we do recommend research, including listening to the show for newbies, is to have these things properly understood. One silly example, Steve, and this is one of those tips for a newbie. I've made this mistake once. I suspect Steve's made it once, where I would argue any person who's experienced should know this. And even then, they still sometimes fuck this one up, Steve. And that's not having everything you need for the cycle, the ancillaries, and the post-cycle therapy on hand at the beginning. Murphy's Law, such as it is, dictates that knowing you can get it and not having it on hand will be the one time that delivery takes 8 weeks instead of 2 weeks or a week. The one time that they run out of the stock you want from your local supplier, your recommended source, Beligas being the example today, of course, and so on. So I would always make sure to have the majority, if not every single thing that I need for the whole cycle and my post-cycle therapy. Because what happens, Steve, if I have to cut my cycle short? Well, I need to wait a week and go to PCT. Oh, but my PCT wasn't meant to be for 7 weeks, for 8 weeks. I was going to get it 6 weeks. No, you need to do this now. You've got this holiday thing coming up. This happens. No, have everything. Understand, for example, that there are some listeners who don't need an AI, and they've never needed an AI. And all of a sudden, they do. Their bodies change, they've got older, they're not in the same condition as they were for the other cycles, and so on. Now they need an AI, but they haven't got it. Have everything you need. And the last thing, Steve, and this especially applies to injectables, and again, this is for newbies, and it's just about being responsible. We've talked about how family, friends, your significant other can sometimes have issues with you using injectable steroids. So it's just a safety thing, whether that's alcohol wipes or some means of cleansing the place you're going to inject with alcohol, a way of keeping your skin clean, safe care, as Steve said, with the pins when you're using them, and specifically proper, sensible disposal. It's very rare now, Steve, but I have seen examples occasionally, it's even ended up in the newspapers, where less than responsible people literally throw the pins, use pins with the caps back on into a box and then just put it out with the rubbish. You do not need to do this. I understand some of you might issue with needle exchange. A buddy will do it for you. You can get a Sharps box on eBay or Amazon, dispose of this shit properly, and then best way to do it would be via a needle exchange. Heck, Steve, if you do that, you haven't even got to pay for your needles and your syringes and so on and so forth. And you can always use a fake name or some bollocks. But 100% responsible use. It's good for you. It's good to have it to persuade others with. If there are kids around, they're not going to come across things they shouldn't in terms of hurting themselves. And it's much nicer for you when you're trying to persuade your significant other to be on side with what you're doing and your chosen path in PED use and training and so on and so forth, if you're responsible about it. And it just means that you're more likely, for example, getting the right pin size, Steve, for injecting and things like this, where, certain products can be harder to inject than others. Some of you prefer the larger gauge needle, some of you do not, and so on and so forth. We even talk about, just not to confuse the issue, sub-Q injections versus intramuscular, people that do TRT daily, for example, and so on. But these are confusing. So the reason why, there's actually a couple of products I'm looking at is the Dynabol Light, which is 10 milligrams from Beligas. They do a Pro Dynabol 20. The reasons why, like I said, are simple cycle of debol, very quick response, lovely pump. It's a pleasurable pump. The VAR pump can be uncomfortable. Short half-life, easy to manage in terms of upping or lowering the dosages, and it's pretty much foolproof. And that's why, especially until maybe very, very recently, Steve, I would say it was the number one all. And I think something Steve says as well, it's cheap.
So
It's cheap.
let's talk about
Yeah.
more cycles that a newbie could do.
Yes.
You talked
Yes.
about Dianabol, and Dianabol, it comes at you from just the estrogen angle. So you can really know what's coming and you can stop it if the
Yeah.
estrogen gets out of control. And you can also use an AI. Balagas has aromatase
Yeah.
inhibitors. So
Yeah.
always keep aromasin on hand or Adix on hand. I'll do
If you
three
was
more.
good, sorry, Steve, I'll ask you one, and you can
Well,
respond. If
let
you
me,
was,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead. Mhm.
I'm thinking of testosterone. So they go on Evo test, which is an enanthate 300. Would that be a good start a new boy cycle for an injectable?
Yeah, so let me talk about that. So I think the thing with testosterone, if you keep the dose low to moderate, I think it
Yeah.
would be a good because you're gonna have and look, some people are very sensitive to testosterone. There's gonna be 10 or 15% of you who will not be able to use testosterone ever. Because I've had clients even run testosterone 100 milligrams a week and get problems, itchy nipples and gyno symptoms. So some of you are going to be extremely sensitive to estrogen, where you're going to have to avoid
Mm.
estrogenic steroids. It's not the end of the world at all. I don't know why people get so upset about it. You've just got to adjust. But I think most of you keeping the dose of testosterone at 400 milligrams a week or less is your best option if you want to go for first cycle. I'll do a couple more. Primobolan, Balagas is an excellent primobolan. It's a gentle steroid. It doesn't cause many side effects. You can run it up to 500 milligrams a week, no problem. Equipoise, same thing, up to 500 milligrams a week. It's another steroid that it's controllable, doesn't come with side effects that are crazy, and you get steady, clean results. I wish more people would use Equipoise as a first cycle. They don't. A lot of people are they get misinformation. I'll put it that way. They get a lot of bad information on equipoise where they think that equipoise is a horse steroid or they think equipoise causes elevated red blood cell count, all that stuff. It does. So does every other steroid. I mean, that's part of using. That's the whole point of using steroids. We want higher red blood cell count. That gives us, that's why people have blood doped over the years who do endurance sports. So when you use equipoise, you're going to get a lot of benefits where you can go heavy
Let
volume.
me
So
ask. Let me ask you another question, Steve. So again, this is why I said earlier in the show, guys. Not everybody wants the same thing from a steroid cycle. If I've talked about this before, looking for strength. Anavar works for me pretty much every single time, from previous use right up to recent use. So very simple would be 30 to 50 milligrams a day. Again, 4 to 8 weeks. And I know that I'm probably going to add 5% of my top numbers on my strength. I don't gain a lot of body weight on Anavar, and I'm not trying to, big enough as it is. But again, I think the average user might look about £5 on and maybe keep 2 to 3 pounds off. That doesn't sound like a lot, but again, 4 to 8 week cycle means you could probably do another cycle later in the year, and I'm guaranteed to get this strength. What I was going to ask you, Steve, and this is the reason why we ask if Steve was doing a consult or if you were doing a log on the forum, guys, and you come to us for advice, we ask certain questions, even as a newbie. For example, there are certain drugs, I'm thinking of probably EQ again, Steve, where it can fuck with some people's hairlines. As Steve said, some people might be testosterone sensitive. It's a silly thing that we might associate with by seeing what your body fat percentage is or how old you are or what you want. Winstrol, for example, we know can have cause some people problems with joints. Do you already have problems with joints? Do you have an ongoing injury that hasn't quite healed up, or you fell off a motorbike, you had a crash years ago? Sounds like why are we asking these questions when you come onto the forums or what Steve's doing a consult with you? But we want to know these things because then the recommendation for your first cycle would be different. Not everybody wants to add 10 pounds of muscle and keep 6 pounds of muscle on their first cycle. They might be ripped already. They might want to stay ripped. The recommendation today, Steve, for example, versus say 5, 10 years ago, was we used to bulk way more body fat versus what we do now. It's much better to have what we call a lean bulk, just adding lean muscular tissue versus adding muscle and a combination of fat and water. Because at some point, you're only going to want to have to lose that. It's the reason why we want you to be clean with your diets. Because ultimately, being as big as a house is fine, but again, you're probably going to want to find
let's
that
talk.
uncomfortable, gain too much weight, etc. So we ask these different things depending upon your aims, and then we make different recommendations. So this is an example, Steve. Suggest a cycle for someone that wants to stay lean or a cutting cycle for a newbie again.
All right, let's talk about a couple orals that Belagas has that's really good too. And you can take a look at Anavar and Taranabol. And these, again, I don't understand why some people are like, oh, you shouldn't use an oral as your first cycle. Why the fuck not? I mean, it's an advantage to use an oral on a first cycle because, as Mobster said earlier in the podcast, there's a short half-life. So you can keep your cycle 4 weeks or less or 5 weeks or less. It's in and out of your system quick. You recover quicker. When you're using, I mean, how can these people how do these people have any logic to what they're saying? Like if you use testosterone, SIP or testosterone E, and you run it for 10 or 12 weeks and you stop, it's going to take weeks for that to be out of your system. So how is there any logic in anyone saying that using testosterone is somehow safer than using an oral as a first cycle? It doesn't make any sense at all. So absolutely, you can use an oral as a first cycle, or you could stack them with some of these. I don't see a problem kickstarting or finishing a cycle with an oral, even if it's your first cycle and you want to use one of these injectables. I see zero issues with that. So I don't know what the problem is. So with Anavar or Turinabol, you can go ahead and run anywhere from 20 to 50 milligrams a day, and you'll have very, very good results, solo or as part of the stacks. If you stack, you can run a lower dose, something closer to 25 milligrams you could do. So I don't see the problem at all. So that would be a good option. I mean, man, if I could do it again, or if I could do it again, I'd probably go down that route, Mob. So I'd probably just go ahead and do an oral steroid as my first cycle, and just have it in and out of my system because my first cycle I did. I ran Deca and Sustanon, and my recovery took a long time. I can remember I got blood work done after PCT. My total testosterone levels were 93 nanograms per deciliter. And I was freaked out about that. So it took me a long time to recover. So again, I don't see the problem with doing that and recovering quicker. So any others you want to add before we move on?
Just as an example, Steve said about the 500 milligrams testosterone, which seems to be very common, probably based on people just experience of doing exactly the same without it necessarily being as completely logical. I've used this analogy or example before, Steve, where I said that I followed my buddies was all of us were using testosterone in Amphate, and yet ironically, as well as they responded, I did not. Whereas I've always had fantastic results using combination of Sustanon and Deca, for example, to blow up. I didn't get the same effects of strength that they did, and they were restricted by body weight, and I was not. They were lifted in body weight classes. So doing what my buddies did because that's what my buddies were doing. And again, I think it was 300 to 500 milligrams a week for 8 to 12 weeks, made no difference to my physique or my strength whatsoever. So again, aim specific, condition specific, age specific, and to a lesser degree, experience specific, because then you can say, this is why I'm doing this. This is what the guys have recommended. These are the side effects I'm looking out for. And again, probably one of the best pieces of advice we can give any cycle that we can suggest or any Beligas product would be, especially as a newbie, start low. When you've got experience, you've got a decent idea based on the same condition and aims, etc., that what worked for you previously, which might be 300 milligrams a week, for example, of testosterone in Amphate, will work for you again. But you might not dislike 500 milligrams. So why not start at 200 milligrams and work your way up to 300 milligrams per week just to see how you respond and feel, etc., versus going hard and not liking how you feel at 500 milligrams. As an example, it's the reason why when you move towards trend, we nearly always suggest 200 to 300 milligrams a week as your first go. And again, you can always up it at some point during the cycle. And then certainly it's something else. It's another reason why we recommend having a log, but also I would keep notes, even actual training diary, where I could say, feel great today on 300 milligrams, might up it to 350, 400, or feel awful, we'll drop it back down 50 or 100 milligrams, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I used to be stuck on certain dosages, Steve. This is the cycle I've planned. This is what I'm going to do. And now when we talk about these shows, and especially for the benefit of other listeners, and especially you newbies, we are more flexible in our approach to the amounts that you can start swapping things out if you're really not getting the results you should do, and so on. And again, using a great source like Beligas helps, Steve, because you and I have had experience of products were underdosed or not dosed at all, or the oils were horrendous, poor condition, late arrivals, etc., the dispatching, product quality, and knowing from the certificates of analysis what's in a product is much easier to do today than it ever was in the past. Let's move on now to the next subject, Steve. I'll let you start.
So, like, look, as a newbie, all of this that we've talked about is pointless if you're buying fake gear or if you're overspending for gear. My first cycle, my gear was legit, but I overspent.
Yeah.
Okay. And I spent probably two or three times what I should have spent because I
Hmm.
didn't know better. I didn't know to use the right brand. I didn't know to use the right source. So luckily, Belagas is here, and you come on the forum, evolutionary.org, and you can find out where to get legitimate Belagas. Belagas not only has quality gear, quality customer service, fast shipping, great prices, but they've been in the business a long time and they also have their products tested constantly. So you don't have to worry about getting a bad batch or you don't have to worry about getting fake gear. You don't have to worry about getting ripped off because their prices are very, very competitive. They're
Yes.
not, they're not like dirt cheap prices, but they're very fair prices compared to
Yeah.
what Mobster and I had to pay for back in the day. So you have to you have to use a legit source, otherwise you're wasting your time. As a newbie, there's no worse feeling than running steroids for the first time and finding out that your gear was fake or finding out that your gear wasn't what you took. That's a big problem. Could you imagine
Yeah.
taking Anavar and it's really debol, and now you get side effects, and now you think that that Anavar gives you those particular side effects when it wasn't Anavar that you were taking. You see the problem? So we have to, we have to make sure we use the right products. Otherwise, you're not gonna learn from your experience. A lot of people have a bias against certain steroids over the years. Where they say, yeah, I don't like this steroid, I don't like that steroid. This steroid didn't do
Yeah.
anything for me. It's not that there's anything wrong with the steroid. It's that they were using fakes or they were using something that they thought that wasn't
Raw
what they thought.
products, unsterile. Steve, I mean, look, Beligas, and I've mentioned this on another show, I'm going to mention it again. We talk about approved sources, we talk about this lab and how long they've been in business. Beligas is an actual pharmaceutical company. It's not a company of the similar sources that we've discussed where they produce great steroids. Beligas is an actual pharmaceutical company based in Belgium, which means apart from the obvious in-house testing, Steve, that we talked about, the sending it out to outside labs and even third party, i.e., end user, like customers like yourself listening to the show that have had products tested, it will have government inspectors coming into the fucking factory, Steve, in Belgium, knocking on the door, let us in. And they will literally walk around the factory and watch the products being made. I mean, it's not, they don't just do steroids, they do a bunch of stuff, Steve, but it's a big pharmaceutical company based out of Belgium. And in order to have these products distributed around the world is a big deal. Seriously, Steve, I mean, I would love, we should try and organize something like this at some point. I would love to go. I mean, I actually know how steroids are made, but I would love to do a sort of factory tour or walk around or whatever else. And you can see, I've worked in a meat processing plant, and I know that the issues of sterility there, you have to dress a certain way, have your hair cut short, weird beard, mask, hair nets, and so on and so forth. It's on another level when we're talking about pharmaceutical costs. And that's what Beligas has. It's literally government regulations and restrictions that they have to adhere to. Government inspection, people can walk in, licenses that are required just to distribute products around the world and so on and so forth. So when we talk about quality, when we talk about safety, etc., this is what they are doing on a daily basis, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's not just because they want to be a good company, they have to be. This is why some people, Steve, are crazy. We got lots of great recommended sources, and we talk about quality and inspection and so on and so forth. But for Beligas, it is a fact of life. It is an every single day. Random inspectors come into the gates of the plant that can come in with licenses, with certificates, etc., and they have to come in at any point. Products that can be pulled off the line and taken to local government testing facilities and certified labs. This is how it's for every single thing that they distribute, they sell, they manufacture and distribute around the world. So that's the kind of definition, if you like, Steve, of pharmaceutical quality in a way that people understand it. The same kind of level of quality for the products that you will see behind the counter with the pharmacist is the same level of quality that this company has to do as a matter of law, as a matter of course, and not just because they want to be a great source. So that's the kind of thing that you're looking at, Steve. Any more thoughts before we finish off the show for newbies?
My thoughts are come on the forum, listen to this podcast. Guys, you've got to do a better job, and gals, you all have to do a better job of getting your information from the right people.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
most of the information out there is shit. And a lot of people, it's amazing how some of these YouTubers out there, they put out
How the hell are they
videos.
getting some of the views they're getting, Steve? I mean, listen, I've told this one just to finish, and I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a very famous YouTuber some years ago who made a kind of thing, is almost known for it, where he was making bullets and loading them into trays and shit while he talked about steroids. I've talked about the late Paul Boris, and even Paul would fuck up from time to time with crazy stuff like that. Hell of a reputation, but sometimes a little bit too far out there for some people. What we try to do with these shows, and the reasons why we try to put out solid information based on approved sources at sensible dosages to keep you safe as possible, while at the same time trying to assist you towards your targets. It's the reason why we encourage you to come on the forums. It's the reasons why we talk about sources like Beligas. And We want you to get great results. We want you to add muscle. We want you to get lean. We want you to stay lean. We want you ripped and vascular. We want to see you looking kind of crazy. And we want you as best we possibly can to do that in a safe and informed manner. So listen, look at Beligas, come onto the forums, be a pain in the ask us annoying questions, tell us as much about yourself as possible, and we'll try to, with our fellow moderators, with our fellow members, assist you on your PED journey. And we can't quite be there to hold your hand, but it'll feel like we are when it comes to doing your first injection or taking your first steroid. Please note, we're not doctors and your opinions are ours. It's our view based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.